Our next speaker is going to present his unique view of the Citizens Party. It's been informed by his extensive experiences in politics. Dr. Hakim Gassiep works as a doctor in general practice here in Melbourne and is the Secretary of the Islamic Society of Melbourne Eastern Regions. Hakim's experience in politics goes back to his early years in apartheid South Africa, where he was a student activist at the University of Western Cape, mainly underground, and the University of Witwatersrand, again underground, before moving to Australia in the late 1970s. From 1989 to 1992, he was the president of the South African ANC support group in Melbourne. Since recently becoming involved with the Citizens Party and becoming a community liaison for the party, he has brought boundless enthusiasm for the party's principles and campaigns. Hakim requested the opportunity to present his views of the ACP's principled approach to politics. So please welcome Dr. Hakim Gassiep.
Good day. Hello. Bonjour. Guten Tag. Hola. Privet. Ni hao. Shalom. Marhaban. Benvenido. Namaste. Assalamu alaikum. I greet you in the spirit of universal brotherhood and common humanity as expressed in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Unfortunately, a common humanity now threatened by the spectre of the insanity of a nuclear conflict. I greet you in the spirit of unity, a principle of oneness of mankind with each other, and oneness of mankind with nature, and oneness of mankind and nature with the cosmos. That is an overarching principle that includes all the principles I will later talk about. The voices of sanity that I talk about, such as Helen Clark in her address to the United Nations Security Council on behalf of the Elders, founded by Nelson Mandela in 2007, where she calls for a set of guiding principles to underpin a pathway towards sustainable peace based on self-determination, sovereignty, and mutual security for both peoples, in reference to the Gaza situation, but it's applicable generally. The ACP always works on the principle that knowledge is power. So this is the principle of knowledge, of beneficial knowledge. The ACP does not believe that power springs from the barrel of a gun, nor does democracy, so repeatedly confirmed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Venezuela. The ACP does not subscribe to the view that the security of a nation is found in the realist model of a balance of power paradigm. Our policies are guided by a promotion of peace paradigm because history has demonstrated that a balance of power approach inevitably leads to the so-called Thucydides trap. Now, the Thucydides trap is not a trap, really, because a rational man can make choices aimed at mutual benefit and not a zero-sum game or beggar-thy-neighbor policies such as sanctions and tariffs. Like before us, the ACP works for and searches for a social justice and equity. We agree with Professor Jeffrey Sachs when he disagrees with Professor John Mearsheimer and avers that there is a choice of a peaceful relationship with China, not only with China, but with all other nations, as BRICS is currently demonstrating. The ACP eschews the negative Hobbesian view of man as brutish, and we prefer to construct our policies on the basis of a more positive approach of mutuality, a more positive approach to the phenomenon of man. The nature of man in the Islamic perspective is that of a fitra, that is, born in with a natural sense of morality and a state of purity, because humanity is a unique form of life. Let's look at this phenomenon of man as expressed by some social entrepreneurs. Lincoln at Gettysburg: a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Australian Citizens' Party aims to ensure that it does not perish from Australia. Martin Luther King: I have a dream that one day that this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The ACP has a dream of a better Australia, and is working to make Australia an island, as described by Einstein in a letter to one of his colleagues when he moved from the terrors of Nazism in Europe to the safety of the United States. He wrote, "How I wish that somewhere there existed an island for those who are wise and of goodwill. In such a place, even I should be an ardent patriot." The ACP is working to make Australia such an island. The farewell sermon of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, can be looked up on Google. All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good actions. This also reflects Carl Gustav Jung's collective consciousness, and it also reflects Pierre de Chardin's idea of a noosphere, the principle of knowledge, which I talked about, where Chardin wrote a couple of books. One was called The Phenomenon of Man, and the other was called The Future of Man. And the one sentence that I got away from his Future of Man is, there is no future for man except in association with all other men. But a common humanity is also demonstrated in sociological research and not only in theological teachings. Who are such social reformers and norm entrepreneurs? Well, Shalom Schwartz is an emeritus professor of psychology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a social psychologist and a cross-cultural researcher. And he's had a look at what is common to humanity. His sociological research finds that there are 10 broad personal values which are likely to be universal and which determines personal behavioral choices as well as political choices. Now, if you look at the diagram, you'll see a number of categories there, a number of values, and these values determine how we think, who we relate to, and what parties we belong to, and the political actions we take. Now, you could draw a couple of Venn diagrams around those 4 categories, and you can take any number of Venn diagrams and see the infinite variety of computations that human beings can behave according to. Now, that relates to the principle of balance, a principle of cooperation, and the principle of mutuality for a civilized society. Now, everyone experiences conflict between change and tradition, between self-enhancement and self-transcendence, between personal power and universalism, Now, Schwartz's analysis explains why international cooperation is possible, why the United Nations was formed. Looking at the statistics, 25% of humans value benevolence, 20% value self-direction, and 25% value universalism. Clearly, a majority chooses cooperation at national and international levels. It also sheds light on the dominance of realist ideology and why the vigor of the remaining 25%, that is, the realists, have historically dominated society and still do. The Australian Citizens' Party is prepared to work with anyone in the interests of the common good and the public interest. So we will look at anybody's value systems and accommodate that. What other principles does the Australian Citizens' Party abide by? Some of our previous speakers have referred to the principle of truth. It is the ACP's firm commitment and dedication to the truth in all matters that has enabled its researchers to expose the inequities and in the financial landscape and the monopoly and exploitative practices of the banking industry. So very well exposed by John Lander and the other speakers. They've also shed light on the political chicanery that resulted in the dismissal of a Great Australia Post CEO, Christine Holgate, by a servile Prime Minister who arrogated to himself 6 ministerial portfolios in a flourish of authoritarian arrogance. The ACP also, on the basis of the principle of truth, demonstrates the control agenda behind the misinformation and disinformation bill, and the flaws in its legal construction, as well as the danger it poses to free speech, rational and valid necessary criticism of government action and inactions, as well as the more serious threat to already threatened conscientious whistleblowers. I've had the honor to meet John Shipton at the launch of the Trust Fall movie at the Nova. It was a great event, John. It was lovely meeting you there. And Julian recently said at a press conference, if lies cause wars, then truth can prevent wars. And I recommend the book, The Trial of Julian Assange by Professor Niels Melzer, a very well-researched book. I've got a signed copy, by the way. On the principles of trust again, the Australian Citizens' Party places its trust on evidence-based research to promote trust in its policies and not on ideological dogma or party partisan caucus strictures, as demonstrated by the Fatima payment debacle. And that debacle and the changing political landscape in Australia has in fact given rise to the Teals, an increased amount of Teals, increased independence, also the phenomenon of wannabe politicians like Clive Palmer, Simon Holmes à Court. The ACP negotiates and dialogues with any citizen or party in trust, where the national interest aligns or converges with their views. Furthermore, as John has pointed out, the world is at war because of the absence of trust. Russia trusted the West when it said, not 1 inch eastward. Iran trusted the United States with the JCPOA, then Trump cancelled. Russia trusted Ukraine in the Minsk agreements, but Angela Merkel confessed it was a ploy to arm Ukraine. The ACP aims to promote trust in the domestic arena as well as in the international stage. There was an issue of trust, as demonstrated by John Lander, when he talked about or Adam Lander rather, when he talked about the branch closures, which was a trusted piece of the agreement in 2004. What other principles does the Citizens Party abide by? They're a courageous lot. The ACP has the courage to challenge the political status quo and question the extent of the ceding of Australian sovereignty in the sometimes spurious interests of national security. The Australian Citizens Party has the courage to be a small party of 30 years and strive for a better political dispensation despite the odds for all Australian citizens. The Australian Citizens Party has the courage to have faith and hope in the common sense and capacity of Australians to change the political paradigm. In that, Barry Jones has written an interesting book called Knowledge, Courage and Leadership. Well, the Australian Citizens Party has risen to the challenge in all those areas. What other principle guides the policies of the Australian Citizens Party? Sovereignty is precious. Sovereignty was established as a norm at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, when a tribal religious solidarity married in territorial integrity and sovereign states were born. Then states became sovereign authorities in their demarcated territories and in relation to each other. And the whole concept and implementation of sovereign rights evolved since then. And people have written about it. For Hobbes, in his book Leviathan, 1651, said that the state has sovereign authority and exclusive power within its territory, and its power is not subject to an external or higher authority. For Rousseau, in his social contract, sovereignty lies in the people. Now, I take issue with Hobbes because there is a higher authority. For Christians, it's God. For Muslims, it's Allah. For practicing Confucians, it's the way of heaven. For secularists, it's international law and international human rights law. And this contradicts the balance of power paradigm, which says that there is no higher authority and that we have to exercise the balance of power to prevent anarchy in the world. And that's just an excuse for hegemony. I invite all Australians to join the Australian Citizens Party in the enterprise of making this island an island of wise people and people of goodwill. George Megalogenis has written a book, I can't remember, I think it's called Australia's Second Chance. Read it, because he postulates that Australia has punched above its weight for many decades in the field of social reform, social justice, political reform, and scientific research. But we've dropped the ball in the last few decades through a series of dysfunctional governments, Labor and Liberal. I invite all Australians to join the Australian Citizens Party and give Australia a second chance. Thank you.